Throughout history, the relative power of Europe has waxed and waned. Starting at the beginning, Europe might as well have not existed, as civilization began to the southeast in Mesopotamia. For most of the thousands of years before the year zero, Europe was just a sideshow, with Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Persia being the centers of attention. Greece was important, but it was always focused on the east, and Alexander the Great saw no reason to attack the barbarians of Europe and instead invaded the center of the world in Persia. Rome was the only real exception to Europe being the periphery, with it making Europe the center of the world, with possibly the exception of the Han Dynasty in China, until the 500s AD. Europe wouldn't really jump back to the world stage until 1492 with the discovery of the Americas, and over the next few centuries, the Europeans became more powerful until the Industrial Revolution allowed them to divide the world between themselves. But two world wars, fought mainly in Europe, decimated the continent and left a vacuum in power which the US and Soviet Union would fill. After the fall of the Soviets, America was a singular global power until China began its rise. Europe is a very developed and rich part of the world, but in terms of power, it is on the back burner compared to the feud between China and America. Europe is supposedly united by the EU, but its power has been contested by the departure of the UK, migration crises, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In 2008, the Eurozone and American economies were close in total GDP, but in 2024, the Eurozone's GDP was slightly over 15 trillion, and America's was slightly under 30 trillion. The main military force defending Europe is NATO, which is effectively American controlled. China is continuing to rise by taking control of natural resources from developing countries and continually spreading their influence worldwide. While upon the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Europe came together to send aid, 4 years later, its support is beginning to waver, with countries like Hungary questioning if it should continue. Even though Europe is still powerful today, it seems like unless it gets its stuff together, it will continue to be dominated by the USA and continually passed up by China and maybe even more developing countries into the future. Of course, the way forward is through the European Union. The European Union was first implemented as this European Steel and Coal Community in 1952. This entity was formed in a world after two world wars and was based on the German question. For most of European history, France was the most powerful continental power, and Britain was powerful but separated by the Channel. Germany was always split between many squabbling states. This all changed in 1871 when Germany united by defeating the French in the Franco-Prussian War. Germany had the largest population besides Russia, the largest industry besides Britain, and the most powerful military. They totally upset the balance of power in Europe, and this was put on full display in World War I when Germany carried the Central Powers against the full power of Britain, Russia, and France for 4 years and succeeded in collapsing the Russian Empire. 20 years later, Germany upset the balance of power again by fully defeating France, capturing most of Europe, and pushing the Soviets to their limit. In the post World War II world, the German question had to be asked. In a way, the Soviets helped solve this problem by forcing the creation of East Germany. If Germany stayed united, it is likely France would have been unwilling to work with them. But West Germany was just weak enough for France to feel safe. This, along with the guaranteed protection of the American military, allowed the Europeans to work on a new strategy of trusting each other. In the book Prisoners of Geography, Tim Marshall writes, "What is now the EU was set up to enable France and Germany to hug each other so tightly in a loving embrace that neither could free an arm to punch each other. This loving embrace started as the European coal and steel community with the original members of West Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, and Italy. This was just an economic union, but it was the first step to European unity. In 1973, the UK, Ireland, and Denmark joined. By 1990, Portugal, Spain, and Greece joined. From 1991, the Soviet Union fell, and this accelerated the expansion of the EU, with many newly independent and democratic nations joining. This coincided with the unification of Germany and launched Germany to the leading member of the EU. By 2014, Sweden, Finland, the Baltic states, Poland, Czechia, Slovakia, Austria, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovenia, and Croatia had to join the EU, and the Schengen zone had been set up, which allowed free movement between members. Along with this, the currency of the euro had been spread to most EU members. In this year, Russia annexed Crimea, and the threat of war came back into the mind of Europeans. In the late teens and early 20s, the unity of the EU came into question because of an immigration crisis, with migrants and refugees from the Middle East and Africa flowing into Europe, causing tensions, and some countries closing their borders. This combined with the UK's exit weakened the Union. In 2022, the Russian invasion of Ukraine temporarily brought the EU back together, but today, stagnating might be the best way to describe the EU. To make the EU stronger, not much has to be changed at the start, but small changes could include aspects which are hard to change with one event. A slightly higher birth rate throughout Europe could lessen the stagnation of Europe, with many European countries today having decreasing populations. As well with this, an easier integration of the euro in many developing countries could help the economy of the EU. The main point of departure for this scenario will be in 2014 with the Russian annexation of Crimea. In real life, sanctions were placed and the annexation was not recognized, but the Europeans ignored the possibility of war. In this new timeline, the annexation prompts the EU to start creating its own unified military force separate from NATO. It also prompts closer economic cooperation. This becomes important in 2016 with the election of Donald Trump as American president. His talks of America lessening its participation in NATO further increases the need for European unity. Along with this, the UK doesn't leave the EU in 2020 because of economic benefits from new policies. By 2022, Norway, North Macedonia, and Albania are added to the EU, while further economic cooperation is set up between the EU, Turkey, Armenia, and Georgia. European unity becomes important in the same year when Russia invades Ukraine. In the early years of the war, Europe and America both send large amounts of military and civilian aid, but in 2024, Donald Trump runs again on a platform of America first and largely pulls back American aid to Ukraine and begins to distance America from Europe in general. As American intelligence systems are recalled from Ukraine, Russia takes advantage and captures Kharkiv, along with relaunching invasions in the direction of Kiev. This leads the EU calling for an immediate ceasefire and peace talks from Putin, otherwise, they will directly intervene. Putin tries to call the EU's bluff and continues, but it turns out to not be a bluff, and the EU declares war on Russia. The European military is largely untested, but with some experienced soldiers from peacekeeping operations and an extremely advanced military, it proves effective. The Russians attempt to close the Suwalki corridor between Kaliningrad and Belarus immediately upon the declaration, but the Europeans stand firm and manage to capture Kaliningrad. This causes the first nuclear scare, but the US informs Russia if a nuclear weapon is used, they will join the war, and China condemns nuclear actions on either side. With nuclear weapons continuing to be avoided, the conventional war begins to swing in the Europeans' favor, and by 2026, most of Ukraine is liberated, except for the very east, around Luhansk, and Crimea is also still under Russian control. Along with this, the Europeans have captured Kaliningrad and Belarus, and have began to push into Russia proper in Karelia and border territories. As the war progresses, the Europeans slowly advance, and both the European and Russian peoples become more scared of nuclear weapons. The Russian people also begin to become tired of war, which boils over on November 6, 2028, when Putin is assassinated by an upstart Russian oligarch and the November Revolution begins. Starting in Moscow and spreading to the front line, Russian soldiers mutiny, and the general population begins to take control of government buildings. This starts the full collapse of the Russian nation, and chaos ensues. Ethnic revolts began to occur in the northern Caucasus and Tatarstan region. Kazakhstan invades to help support the Tatars. Georgia invades to protect itself from rebels. Japan occupies its disputed territories with Russia. And most importantly, China invades bordering Russian territories, which they say is to protect China from the chaos of the fallout. On December 21st, the shaky new Russian government officially surrenders to the Europeans and asks for European help to establish order in the nation. By 2030, peace has been secured through much work and compromise. In the peace deal, Russia is divided into regions which will be incorporated into the EU, and two Siberian republics in the east, with the easternmost one being under Chinese influence. Four new states are created out of Russia to be added to the EU. The Russian state is set up in the Russian heartland. What is called the Eastern Territories is set up in the Ural region, where many minority groups, such as Tatars and Uralic speaking peoples, reside. And in the Northern Caucasus, the Dagestan and Circassian states are set up. Along with this, large border territories are added to the Ukrainian and Belarusian states, which are also added to the EU. Small border territories are added to the Baltic states, while Finland annexes the large Karelian areas. After the war, the European Union is increasingly federalized and begins to separate itself from the US. During this period, the US becomes increasingly isolationist, with most of its international actions being taken in the Pacific region, as the EU begins to be the main power interfering in the Middle East. By 2034, Turkey, Georgia, and Switzerland are added to the EU, with a larger customs union being created for nations which want economic but not political ties to the EU. The Western Siberian nation, as well as the Eastern territories, which have not yet fully been incorporated to the EU, join, along with Kazakhstan. In the Middle East, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Algeria, and Tunisia join, along with Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Jordan, after an EU intervention in the Israel Palestine conflict. A major change in the EU occurs in 2035 when the redistricting takes place. This creates massive changes in the internal borders of the Union. Along with these border changes, German is adopted as the official language of the EU and is began to be taught at schools across the nation, but only as a secondary language. Native languages are encouraged to be taught, with dozens of minority languages being recognized. Over the next decade, the European Union works on stabilizing itself and expanding its influence in the world stage, taking over American influence in the Middle East and Africa before China can jump in. The next major event for the EU happens in 2042 with the Iranian Civil War, where revolts break out against the authoritarian government and ethnic minorities begin to rise up, with the Azeris in the northeast, the Kurds in the east, the Arabs in the southeast, and the Balochis in the southwest. This wave of revolution also spreads into Afghanistan, where Chinese supported forces push out the Taliban and began to establish a more stable government, even if it is still authoritarian. Pakistan also invades border areas in Afghanistan and Persia under Chinese supervision. By 2044, the civil war largely ends, with in the east, Afghanistan and West Tajikistan being united under a Chinese supported government, and East Tajikistan being annexed by China. Pakistan expands into Baloch and Pashtun territories, but is forced to give up claims on parts of Kashmir as to not upset the balance of power too much. The Azeri regions of Iran are added to the Azerbaijan state in the EU. The Kurdish revolt in Iran spread into Iraq and even the EU, causing the creation of the Kurdistan state, which joined the EU. In exchange for Kurdish majority regions, Iraq is granted Arab majority regions of Iran, and Syria is granted Arab regions of Turkey. After the Iranian Civil War, the European Union is a definitive Middle Eastern power, and many nations are added to their custom union. Tensions start getting alleviated as European economic aid and support of democracy begins a slow transition to responsible democratic government in the Middle East. This is the map of the spheres of influence in the year 2050. The world is mainly divided between the three superpowers of the USA, China, and the EU, along with a more regional power of India. After 2020, the Americans largely began to pull back from being the global police and turned inward, mostly focusing on internal issues. Any attention on the world stage from the US is mostly focused on the Pacific region to stop China from becoming too dominant. To this end, The US retains tight alliances with Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, Vietnam, Australia, and New Zealand. But the US has still lost much ground to China, as with their withdrawal from world politics, nations like South Korea and Indonesia felt they had no choice but to turn to China. Kim Jong un died in 2048, and North Korea fell into chaos, which caused China to intervene. During the decades leading up to this point, South Korea had becoming more tied to China, and China allowed the reunification of Korea, leading to an even stronger partnership. Many nations in Southeast Asia also began to turn to China as the Americans left them behind. Some nations, though, like Myanmar and Malaysia, decided to turn to India instead to avoid Chinese influence. This began to build India's sphere as many nations in East Africa started growing closer to India to avoid exploitative Chinese practices. In Africa, China has gained influence over much of the continent in the American absence, with the Indians set up in the east and the Europeans in the north and south. The only real American allies in Africa are Liberia and Nigeria. In the Americas, the USA still mostly reigns supreme, but certain nations like Nicaragua and Peru have started to lean closer to China. The European Union is a major player on this world stage and is considered to have passed up the US. The Europeans, in conjunction with their custom union, control most of the world's natural gas reserves and much of its oil. The EU also has much higher levels of development than China and India, and with China's population on the decline, the Europeans seem poised to be the superpower of the future. In 2050, the European Union spans the entire European continent, along with territory past the Urals and a large amount of territory in the northern Middle East. Along with this continental territory, they control many islands in the Arctic Ocean and many overseas territories situated in the Atlantic, Indian, and Pacific Oceans, as well as French Guiana on mainland South America. The European Union has slightly over a billion citizens, with the third largest population in the world. They are substantially behind India, who has over 1.6 billion people, and China, which is slightly under 1.3 billion people. India is still growing faster than the European Union, but the Europeans are steadily growing, which is partially supported by immigration. China, on the other hand, has begun its population decline, but a population collapse is considered imminent, with its population predicted to reach 800 million by 2080. Behind the European Union are the United States, Pakistan, and Nigeria, all with around 360 million people. The European Union is by far the largest country area-wise, covering over 14 million square kilometers, and the next largest country by area being Canada, with almost 10 million square kilometers. Economy-wise, the Union has recently passed up the United States in GDP, with just over 57 trillion, and the Americans slightly over 55. Of course, the US only has 381 million people and destroys the European Union on a per capita basis, with over 144,000 per person. The European Union, on the other hand, has a little over 54,000 per person. Even though it controls many highly developed regions, it also controls newly acquired war-torn regions such as Russia and Kurdistan. In overall GDP, China comes in behind the US with around 52 trillion total and 25,000 per capita. Then, a large fall to fourth place is India, with around 18 trillion total GDP. The capital of the European Union is Brussels, which has been official ever since the European Parliament moved to Brussels in 1974. Ever since 2035, the official language of the EU has been German, which was chosen to differentiate the Union from the idea of English being the money language of the world, and to promote unity in the Union. But dozens of languages are recognized in the EU and allowed to be taught as a primary language in schools around the nation. The European Union is composed of 28 member states and 6 territories, including the Capital Territory. Many of these states resemble the countries that were part of the EU before federalization, but after the redistricting, many border changes occurred to fit ethno-linguistic lines to the best of their ability. With the increased federalization of the EU, these internal borders don't matter nearly as much, with the central government holding many powers over legislation, enforcement, and taxes. Some of the most important states include Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and Turkey. The European Union has 115 metro areas with a population over 1 million, but their largest metro area in Moscow is only the 20th largest in the world with 24.76 million. Moscow is the heart of Russia, and even after the Russo-Ukraine War, remains the largest city in the EU, with a large repopulation after the conclusion of the conflict. The EU's second largest metro area is Istanbul, which is one of the most geographically advantaged cities on Earth, as it guards the entrance to the Black Sea. It holds a population of 21.27 million in its expanded urban area. Istanbul has been the city connecting Europe to the east since it became the Roman capital in 330 AD and continued under the Ottoman Empire and later Republic of Turkey before it joined the EU. In third is London with 16.82 million. London is the center of Britain and an economic and tourist giant. In fourth is London's twin across the Channel in Paris with a population of 14.47 million. Similarly to London, Paris is the center of France and is important economically, and even more important for tourism and the spread of European culture. In fifth is the Rhine-Ruhr metro area in far western Germany with a population of 13.78 million. The Rhine-Ruhr metro area is a pluricentric metro area containing cities such as Cologne, Dusseldorf, Dortmund, Essen, and Bonn, which have all grown into one metro area with population growth. The other metro areas with over 5 million population are Madrid, the capital and largest city of the Iberian state, Milan, the economic center of Italy, St. Petersburg, the historical capital of the Russian Empire, Manchester, the second largest city in Britain and the center of North England, Ankara, the capital of the old Turkish Republic and the modern Turkish state, Berlin, the capital of the German state, Barcelona, the second largest city in Iberia and the center of Catalonia, Kiev, the capital of the Ukrainian state, which has grew a large amount after the war, Birmingham, the third largest city in Britain, and nearly Naples, the heart of southern Italy. The top 30 metro areas also include the capital of the EU in Brussels, with nearly 5 million inhabitants, as well as Öresund in Scandinavia, Baku in Azerbaijan, Athens in Greece, Rome in Italy, Frankfurt, Hamburg, Munich, Stuttgart, and Vienna in Germany, Rotterdam and Amsterdam in the Netherlands, Izmir in Turkey, Lisbon in Iberia, and Warsaw in Poland. The official language of the EU is German, but on the state level, there are 91 state official and recognized minority languages, with even more recognized on smaller subdivision levels. The languages on this map are colored by family. Reddish pink to purple are Romance languages, with languages such as Portuguese, Spanish, Catalan, French, Italian, and Romanian. For many languages, highly divergent dialects are also colored, such as Occitanian and southern France. In green are Germanic languages like English, Dutch, German, and the Scandinavian languages. In orange are the Baltic languages of Lithuanian and Latvian. In blue are the Slavic languages such as Polish, Czech, Serbo-Croatian, Ukrainian, and Russian. In light gray is Albanian. In brown is Greek. In light pink are the Iranian languages like Persian and Kurdish. And in white is Armenian. So far, all the languages mentioned are part of the Indo-European language family, which is the largest language family by number of speakers in the world and in the EU. The language family with the second largest number of speakers in the EU is the Turkic language family. These languages are in red and include languages such as Turkish, Azeri, Chuvash, Tatar, and Bashkir. In yellow are the Uralic languages such as Hungarian, Finnish, Estonian, Sami, and Udmurt. In the Caucasus Mountains, there are three native families: Kartvelian, or Southwest Caucasian in purple, Circassian, or Northwest Caucasian in teal, and Northeast Caucasian languages in yellow-green. Also near the Caucasus Mountains is the Kalmyk language in gray, which is actually related to Mongolian. Finally, in black on Malta is Maltese, which is actually related to Arabic. Basque in black in northern Iberia and southern France is an isolate, and Greenlandic in bright purple is related to other Native American languages in Canada and Alaska. The most spoken individual languages in the EU are German, with over 120 million native speakers, but with many more speaking it as a second language. Russian also has over 120 million native speakers, but many less speak it as a second language. English has over 90 million native speakers in the EU and over 2 billion native and second language speakers worldwide. French, Turkish, Italian, Ukrainian, and Kurdish also all have over 50 million native speakers in the EU. The European Union, in general, is still quite religious, but has lower levels of religiosity than other regions of the world, with around 20 to 25% of people considering themselves to be atheist or irreligious. Certain regions in the UK, along with Eastern Germany, Estonia, and many parts of Nordic regions, are majority atheist. Our levels of religiosity have stopped declining in recent years, and some reports suggest an increase. By far the largest religion is Christianity, with around 60% of Europeans considering themselves to be Christian to some degree. All three main branches of Christianity have a large presence in the EU, with Orthodoxy in purple, Catholicism in yellow, and Protestantism in blue. Islam is the second largest religion, with around 15 to 20% of people following Islam, mostly concentrated in newly acquired territories in the Middle East. But through migration, many Muslims live in Christian majority regions. The majority of the Muslims in the EU adhere to Sunni Islam, with a small Shia minority. The only other religion that is a majority in a region is Buddhism in the Kalmyk region of Dagestan. Other religions that don't control the majority anywhere are Hinduism and Judaism, who each, along with Buddhism, have less than 1% of citizens following them. One of the largest projects undertaken by the EU is the expansion of the European wide system of high speed rails. Even before the federalization of the EU, many countries had their own specific high speed rails, but upon federalization, a connection and expansion of these rail lines was announced, stating that every major city should eventually be connected by high speed rails. For this project, a high speed rail was considered a rail that traveled over 500 kilometers per hour. In the modern day, the EU has divided its extensive high speed rail system into 12 subsystems. Now, I will show maps of all the European states and territories, going into more depth on their individual demographics. Feel free to pause the video at any point to examine any map, but for now, thanks for watching.